everybody in a couples need two things. They need stability and they need intimacy. Those are two sets of needs that people crave. And I'm calling them needs because, I could say I need something when really what I mean is I desire something. I don't necessarily need things that I desire. But these are needs in the sense that if they're not sufficiently fulfilled, something is not working right. Something is dysfunctional.
Mm.
So those two needs, stability and intimacy, the interesting thing about those two needs is that the skills you need for those two needs are quite different from each other. In fact, they're somewhat in a kind of tension with each other. The skills you need for stability are all about keeping the anxiety level relatively low. So what are the skills of stability? Well, more or less showing up when you say you're going to show up and more or less being sober most of the time. People who have serious substance issues, it's very destabilizing. Not cheating, things like that. In monogamous relationships, when somebody is cheating, it's hugely destabilizing, spikes everybody's anxiety. Not doing things like that are all in the domain of stability. People who are generally speaking functioning reasonably well and aren't psychotic, they're not nuts, are usually pretty good at stability. Most of the folks who come to see me are usually pretty good at stability. Stability requires that you keep the anxiety level low. Well, intimacy, on the other hand, the chief skill of intimacy is to tolerate anxiety rather than avoiding it. And sometimes people look at me funny and say, well, wait a minute, I thought intimacy is supposed to feel good, right? I don't just mean, when I talk about intimacy, I don't just mean sex, for example, although sex is often part of it. I mean, more generally, when a couple is being intimate, they are being honest with themselves and each other. And when things are going well, that's lovely. That's not, that doesn't require tolerating anxiety. That just feels great.
Welcome to your Wordless podcast, the space where we redefine success, self-worth, and transformation. I am Nierras, the soul-centered architect of transformation, helping you unlock your highest potential and build a legacy beyond limits. Now, whether it is self-mastery, career breakthroughs, or world creation, this is where change begins. Now let's dive in.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's delightful to be here.
So much to unpack. Okay. So, first off, can you share with us what was it like growing up as a doctor?
Well, of course, I didn't start out as Dr. Bruce, did I?
Yes.
But actually, my career has taken several turns along the way. Early on, I was a statistician for a while. I actually got a master's degree in statistics, and I was teaching statistics at the University of Vermont while I was getting my PhD in psychology. And then got interested, and the PhD in psychology was mostly on the research side of things, coming from statistics. I was working actually as a statistician in the computer center, helping researchers at the university, deal with their statistical issues. And then I transitioned into the clinical stuff. So that took a while. And along the way, I had some other bits of career going on. And so I didn't really get into doing clinical work until I was close to 40. So I started somewhat later, which for me felt kind of like I needed to. I needed some maturity before I felt like I could be privileged to be admitted into people's lives the way psychologists are.
Consulting people, yes.
Yeah. And over time, as I've done the work, and as you mentioned, I've been in private practice now for over 30 years. And, I was doing internships and stuff before that. And the more I did it, the more intrigued I was by working with couples. I just started to really love working with couples. There's something first of all, it's often difficult work, but it's rewarding work because the struggles that people are going through are so clear and right there in the room. And I just found the more I did the work, the more inspired I was by seeing people deal with those struggles. And so I kept more and more sort of zeroing in on couples work. And for the last, 10 or 15 years, it's been the large majority of the work that I'm doing. And so I started writing books about that. Actually, before that, I was doing some videos. I had some various ideas I developed and had, of course, taken from other folks and kind of turned into my own. And I started doing some videos. And after a while, I realized, I think there's a book there. So I wrote that first book, which was Reigniting the Spark, sort of centered on Well, I'll tell you the origin story actually of the title of our podcast. This is where the title of our podcast came from. You mentioned the podcast my wife Judy Alexander and I do. It's called Couples Therapy in 7 Words. So what are the 7 words? Actually, I have a prop here. We have merch. I don't know how many of your people are listening rather than seeing. So if you're just
Yeah,
listening, you won't see this. But for people who are watching it, it says on the cup, "Be kind, don't panic, and have faith." The other side is the logo for our podcast. Those are
that
seven
is so
words. Now,
cute.
where did those 7 words come from? Well, it it started early on in my practice. So we're probably talking, I don't know, 25, 27 years ago, something like that. I was at a consultation group meeting. A bunch of colleagues get together and kind of talk about our work and bounce
Mm-hmm.
ideas off each other. And we were on the way out. We were leaving the room. And one of my colleagues just turned to me and said, "How do you do couples therapy anyway?" Which is kind of a silly question. And he realized it was a silly question. What am I supposed to say there literally walking out of the door? But I had been giving it some thought. And I said, well, I suppose if you really boil it all down, it's oversimplifying, but if you really boil it all down, basically what I'm trying to tell people is be kind in the sense of, sense that you are kin with each other. Sense your kinship, be kind and don't panic. And the reason for don't panic is that's the only way you can be kind. If you're in a panic, you can't be kind. And so many of the techniques that we learn, when we're learning to do couples therapy, and actually when we learn to do individual therapy for that matter, so many of the techniques we learn are about helping people not panic, deal with the anxiety without crossing over into panic. So that's 5 words, be kind and don't panic. And I started sharing that with folks. I said, it occurs to me a lot of what we're doing here is that. And they would say, wow, that's really interesting. And then they would say, well, okay, so how do we not panic? That's the key. Like, how do you not panic? And
Mm-hmm.
I said, wow, that's a good question. And I don't have a simple formula for how to not panic, but I did have an observation, which is that the couples that seem to be able to get through the anxiety without panicking and deal with the hard stuff they had to deal with were showing a mindset. And I hunted around for a word to describe the mindset. And the best word I came up with was faith. And I don't necessarily mean religious faith, but they had a mindset that said, somehow this whole existence business is right to be what it is, even when it's really hard. We can't always understand it. We can't always make sense of it, but there's got to be something right about the whole business. Things arise for good reason, even if we don't know what it is. That's what I mean by faith. So be kind, don't panic, and have faith. So you have faith so that you cannot panic, and you don't panic so you can be kind. So that's the 7 words. So that first book I wrote, the one called Reigniting the Spark, is organized around those 3 principles: be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And I expand on that, of course. Somehow I can't seem to explain the whole thing in 7 words. It's just a summary, but that seemed to be helpful to folks. And I have a lot of other concepts that are related to that, but that's where that first book came from.
Okay, couples therapy. And
Mhm.
so I want to ask you, Dr. Bruce, why stable couples lose intimacy?
Yes, great. Glad you asked that. Yes, that's the subtitle of that first book, isn't it? Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I'll tell you why. And I have to credit, I mean, there's all kinds of people I could credit for some of these ideas, and I've developed them too. In a nutshell, why do stable couples lose intimacy? Well, what couples everybody needs, I claim, this is one way of looking at things.
Are you stuck in a job that you don't love, feeling like you're meant for more? It is not in your head, it is in your soul. I am Nick Nierras, and I help high achievers like you break free from burnout, rewire self-doubt, and build a life aligned with purpose through coaching, hypnotherapy, and soul activation. Because let's face it, real wealth isn't just about money, it is about aligned and happy heart, mind, and soul. Now, remember, you are worthy and you are enough. Let's transform your life together. Visit www.thenicknierrasholisticlifestyle.com to begin.
Everybody in a couples need 2 things. They need stability and they need intimacy. Those are 2 sets of needs that people crave. And I'm calling them needs because, I could say I need something when really what I mean is I desire something. I don't necessarily need things that I desire. But these are needs in the sense that if they're not sufficiently fulfilled, something is not working right. Something is dysfunctional.
Mm.
So those 2 needs, stability and intimacy, the interesting thing about those 2 needs is that the skills you need for those 2 needs are quite different from each other. In fact, they're somewhat in a kind of tension with each other. The skills you need for stability are all about keeping the anxiety level relatively low. So what are the skills of stability? Well, more or less showing up when you say you're going to show up, and more or less being sober most of the time. People who have serious substance issues, it's very destabilizing. Not cheating, things like that. In monogamous relationships, when somebody is cheating, it's hugely destabilizing, spikes everybody's anxiety. Not doing
Mm-hmm.
things like that are all in the domain of stability. People who are, generally speaking, functioning reasonably well and aren't psychotic, they're not nuts, are usually pretty good at stability. Most of the folks who come to see me are usually pretty good at stability.
Mm.
Stability requires that you keep the anxiety level low. Well, intimacy, on the other hand, the chief skill of intimacy is to tolerate anxiety rather than avoiding it. And sometimes people look at me funny and say, well, wait a minute, I thought intimacy is supposed to feel good, right? I don't just mean, when I talk about intimacy, I don't just mean sex, for example, although sex is often part of it. I mean, more generally, when a couple is being intimate, they are being honest with themselves and each other. And when things are going well, that's lovely. That's not, that doesn't require tolerating anxiety. That just feels great. You can have these lovely moments of connection. But what about if somebody wants to do something as simple as a regular old garden variety complaint? Hey, I wish you wouldn't do X, Y, or Z that you're doing, or I wish you would do more of X, Y, or Z that you're not doing, or something like that. Issuing a complaint to your partner is going to raise their anxiety and your own, especially if you've had experiences with each other where somebody complaining about something, it tends to go off the rails because people get defensive, or they end up in a fight, or they end up in a deep freeze, or whatever. So that's the one aspect of intimacy that feels a little dangerous. And then more generally, not just complaints, but things like fantasies. That's certainly true in the sexual domain, but not even in the sexual domain. Fantasies about, oh, I've been thinking I want us to go live somewhere else for 6 months, and I'm worried if I tell you that you're going to freak out. That's an intimate moment. And what stable couples tend to do, and finally getting around to answering your question, what stable couples tend to do, for good reason, is they'll avoid that level of anxiety. And when they do that, they avoid intimacy. And I'm
Wow.
claiming that intimacy is every bit as important as stability is. And my favorite metaphor, it's funny, this is a little talk I give to pretty much every couple in the first session. I talk to them about stability and intimacy, and I keep doing it because they keep telling me, ooh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. The My favorite metaphor about that is, if you think about a plant, a living organism, a seed gets planted in soil, and it germinates and it sprouts and it starts to grow. And then somebody comes along and paves a sidewalk over it. Why do they pave a sidewalk over it? Well, because they want things to be more stable, right? That's a sidewalk. It's easier to walk on than squishing along in the mud, right?
Yeah.
So they pave a sidewalk over it. And what happens is that plant is not going to just sit there. It's going to try and crack the sidewalk, or it'll die trying. If you think about that plant, the roots provide stability, but intimacy is the energy for growth. Living organisms want to grow. They want to be intimate with their environment. And so they'll try and crack the sidewalk. And that's the metaphor. But in a couple, what does that look like? What does, metaphorically cracking the sidewalk look like in a couple? It looks like, for example, an affair. It's not always the reason for an affair, but it's often the reason. If intimacy is compromised, some people often become vulnerable to someone
Other
else's
people.
attentions, to other people.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes.
that's to crack the sidewalk. Sometimes someone just gets depressed. They just shut down. Sometimes somebody will, without any warning, just say, I can't stand this anymore. I'm out of here.
Mm.
All of those things are often, not always, but often symptoms of some kind of lack of intimacy that's going on. So the work of couples therapy is often about finding ways of tolerating that anxiety so that people can actually deal with these scary things and restore intimacy. Or sometimes they end up realizing, wow, we can have these intimate conversations where we realize in our intimate conversations, oh, we're really not right for each other. We are so wanting to go in different directions. It's sort of a deal breaker. So we can wish each other well and, separate. I like the ones where they where they find each other again. That's a
Mm.
bias on my part. I like it when they stay together. People don't have to do that for me, but I like that. That often, it's really inspiring, because when people are, especially when there's been something like a betrayal, a
Yeah.
huge breach in, I mean, betrayal is a big word. You can't be betrayed by a total stranger. You can only be betrayed by
Yes.
someone you have expectations of.
Exactly.
Yeah, based on your relationship.
Mm.
And when that's what a couple is dealing with, they're having to question everything. And the couples that can get through that and find each other again. It's really very inspiring. So that's what I write about in the last book I've written, the most recent one, Betrayal and Forgiveness. I write about 12 different, I call them couples. They're not all romantic couples. There's some, many of them are, but there's some of them are like, there's some siblings, there's some business partners, people who betray each other in a particular kind of relationship, and how they are able to work through that and figure out how to go forward. And spoiler alert, some of them stay together and some of them don't. I sort of report on what happened, but the work is really, I was inspired by it. That's why I wanted to write.
Hi, I'm Nierras, your host of the Your Wordless podcast. Now, if these real raw stories hit home, don't wait. Please follow, like, and subscribe my Spotify and YouTube. For bite-sized inspirational reels, follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn. Don't wait. Your transformation starts today. Thank you, and bye for now. I want to go to that betrayal part and learning to trust again. But before that, I also want to pick up on the part where you mentioned the couples. Now, it's like a paradox, right? Stable and intimacy. Now, intimacy meaning, when I think of it, it's like people crave excitement. That means they want to grow, and whether or not the other party or the other partner would want to grow with them in the way that they had envisioned themselves to be or the relationship to be in, that often becomes the limiting factor.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if both parties agree, hey, okay, let's tolerate, this time we're going to do this, that next time we're going to do that, then that's okay. But often it happens when maybe one is again not stable enough in terms of their emotion, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
or yeah, emotion, and say, oh, you often every time you want to do something, it's always your way. When are we going to go my way? When are we going to do it? When are we going to take, our holidays in Europe? It's always been Asia, Asia, Asia. So, and okay, often one party, almost always, I didn't look at the statistics. You are obviously the expert in that. Often men will usually keep their mouth shut.
Yeah, right on. Yes.
Yeah. So,
Yep.
okay. So I guess the question's two prong. Number one, how do we get it back? And what are the common themes during your sessions with your clients?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do we get it back? Meaning like intimacy, right? That's what you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Balance. And that balance, stable, but at the same time, we're trying something new. But again, it's not just confined to trying something new. It's more than that. It's nuance. Yeah. So
Yeah. No, absolutely. And of course, as you're pointing out there, it's not like we're saying, oh, to heck with stability and just go with intimacy. That doesn't work either. That's
yeah.
what an affair is, actually. Affairs are often all intimacy and zero stability. They're kind of pseudo intimacy.
Yeah.
Very often, and I know of exceptions, but very often when people break up to be with an affair partner, it doesn't work, because when they actually try to
Yeah.
create a life together, they realize, oh, there's all these reasons why we're not compatible, and we didn't realize that in the rush of the
In
affair.
the moment.
Yeah. But no, that's great. How do you get that back? How do you work with it? It's all about that concept of tolerating the anxiety. A lot of the work is about being able to look at assumptions. It's often about looking at assumptions you don't even know you're making. Things that you're assuming about how the relationship has to be, how your own role in the relationship or your partner's role has to be. Questioning all of those assumptions is really scary often. And being able to look at that and hear the other person, hear things maybe you don't want to hear, and sit with that requires tolerating a lot of anxiety. But that's how intimacy, if it's going to be restored in a way that the couple wants to stay together, that's how it'll happen. And it's so interesting because the couples that can do that, and again, I go back to the notion of when there's been like a betrayal or somebody's cheated or something like that, the couples that can survive that will find the only way they survive it is if things are better than they ever were. And the reason they'll be better than they ever were is that they've learned so much more about themselves and each other. They've kind of broken down whatever their rigid categories were. They've softened all of that up so they can actually Yeah, it's scary, but they can actually experience some new things with each other. And that's when
It
they'll often
permeates.
rediscover. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it permeates not only their relationship. One of
Mm.
my favorite stories, I think I mentioned it in one of my books, is a couple I worked with a few years ago. This is pre-pandemic when I'm doing all telehealth since the pandemic, but this was in my office. And we knew this was their last session because they were moving. They were relocating out of town. And they had worked with me for about a year and a half. And what had brought them to me was the man had cheated on the woman. He also was having serious alcohol problems. They were really a mess when they first came in there. The woman had lost like 30 pounds in 3 weeks or something. I mean, she's just horribly, just a mess in
Hmm.
her own description.
Yeah.
And they did amazing work over that in terms of, the guy was totally accountable and responsible and addressed his drinking problem. Anyway, so here we are at the last session, having done all this work. They are getting along so much better than they ever had. And the woman turns to the man and says, "Hey, thanks for taking one for the team." And he looks at her and says, "Hey, what do you mean by that?" And I look at her and say, "Hey, what do you mean by that?" It's an interesting comment. And she said, "Well, you're the one who had to feel guilty because he's the one who did the cheating. So she wasn't saying thanks for cheating. I've never heard anybody say, "Well, thanks for cheating. That was great." Nobody's ever said that I've heard. But she was absolutely saying, "You know what? We needed a crisis.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. I
something needed
needed
to
a
happen here."
power moment for us
Yeah.
to realize.
Yeah.
Wow.
We needed a crisis and we didn't know we needed it, but we did. Wish you hadn't done what you did, but what the heck? Look at how
Mm-hmm.
much better off we are. And that's when she started saying, it's not only that our relationship is better. She was saying, I'm getting along better with our kids. I'm getting along better with my coworkers. It's because all of these ways that she was realizing about herself, that she was fundamentally afraid of lots of living, she was no longer afraid of for having gone through this crisis. And the fact that they could rediscover each other was just icing on the cake. She was going to benefit one way or the other. But what that required was both of them having that level of courage so that they could do it. But then they could find each other and they had this wonderful relationship. So, it was really, I just love that comment. It's like, hey, thanks for taking one for the team, because
Yeah.
of course he felt guilty appropriately.
Of course.
He,
Of
he had done things
course.
that were wrong according even to his own values.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, that precipitated the crisis that, in hindsight, that's what they needed.
That is such a powerful way of looking at it. I have so many things in my head right now that I want to ask, but I guess I know you mentioned a bit about learning to trust again, right? So for those people who's just who are maybe listening to this and then they were not getting it, but after hearing you said that, they become very, very interested to knowing more, especially if I put that chapter and then they want to go and skip to that part. How do we learn to trust again?
Yes. Well, there's something you better not skip first because, and I'll
Yes,
talk
yes.
about that. So
Okay.
the title of the book is Betrayal and Forgiveness, right? How to navigate the turmoil and learn to trust again. So I'm implying in that title, and of course I say so in the book, forgiveness is an interesting step in there. Now, what do I mean by forgiveness? And here I better define the term. There's basically two ways people use the word forgiveness. They're both fine ways, but there's one in particular I like and the other I don't. I'll
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you what I mean by that. One way people often use the word forgiveness, they'll say, "Well, if I forgive someone who hurt me, that means all right, I'll restore the relationship. We'll kind of wipe it clean. We'll be fine with each other. We'll carry on." That's like when people use the expression forgiving a debt, a financial debt. If you've forgiven a financial debt, that just means, all right, you know what? You no longer owe it to me. We're fine. Let's carry on a relationship, which is, an understandable way of using the word forgive. But that's not the way I'm using it. I'm using it another way, which a lot of other people use as well. I'm saying, no, forgiveness is an inside job. I didn't coin that phrase, but I like it. Forgiveness is an inside job, which is to say, I can forgive somebody. My forgiving someone who hurt me has almost nothing to do with them. It's all about my not being obsessed anymore about it, my not being angry. I can let go of the anger. I can let go of the obsession. I can not panic when I think about it. I can basically, in trauma terms, we would say you can process the trauma. So you're no
Mm-hmm.
longer, your brain no longer goes into fight or flight mode or freeze mode when you think about it. That's what processing trauma is about. That has nothing whatever to do with whether I trust somebody. I can forgive somebody that I don't trust at all. I can forgive somebody who doesn't deserve it in any sense, who's not sorry, who hasn't learned anything, I can forgive that person, which is to say I can let go of my anger. Now I have to figure out, all right, can I trust them? So the step of forgiveness, I think, is a necessary step before you get to deciding if you can trust somebody. If you're internally flying into a rage every time you think about what they did, it's going to be very difficult to trust someone. So when I say you have to forgive before you trust, I don't mean you have to forgive, period. There are plenty of circumstances where I even have a chapter in the book about maybe it may be premature to forgive. If you're in an abusive relationship and you're still being abused, that's no time to forgive. That's the time to keep your anger. That's the time to say, because the anger is going to motivate you to try and find a way to get out. So forgiveness is only possible when you're safe enough to do so. But when you are, I and many, many other people like to quote Anne Lamott. She's a novelist, but she's written a lot about this. She has a wonderful quote about forgiveness. It goes something like this: to not forgive is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. It doesn't, you're just poisoning yourself. It doesn't do it has nothing to do with the rat, And of course, if you follow up on that, it's basically, what you need to do is get the poison out of yourself. Then you can worry about the rat. The rat's still there. Maybe there's still a rat. Maybe they're not a rat. Maybe you can say, actually, and when I think about this, maybe I can realize it is possible to trust this person because I can understand what happened. I said forgiveness is an inside job. Trust is a two-way street. For me to trust someone who's hurt me, I have to be able to get from them a clear sense that they understand what they did, that they actually do regret it. They don't just regret that they got caught, they
Mm-hmm.
actually say, wow, I don't want to have that effect ever again. And I understand it. And here's what I have learned that will give you reason to think, oh, okay, I have reason to think this won't happen again. And moreover, I've learned enough about myself that I can forgive myself. That's the step one in forgiveness is forgive yourself for getting hurt. Because we always blame ourselves. That is part of the way we are wired. If something happens to us, part of us, we partly blame ourselves because that gives us a sense maybe we had some control. Little kids do that. Little kids who are being abused do that. They will blame themselves for it. Even those same kids, when they grow up to adults, often will still blame themselves.
Yeah.
Somebody was sexually abused at 3 and they'll say, well, I should have stopped it. Are you serious? Really? You think you could have stopped it at 3 years old? They may know rationally they couldn't, but they will often emotionally still blame themselves because it gives them some sense of control, even if it isn't
Yeah.
accurate. Because otherwise, life is incredibly terrifying. So forgiving yourself is always the first step. But if you can forgive yourself, and then if you can extend that to say, well, you know what, I was doing the best I could, knowing what I knew and not knowing what I didn't know. I guess that was true of this other person. They shouldn't have done what they did, but I can sort of see where they were coming from, even though I wish they weren't. When you can get there, then you might be able to rebuild trust. And the person who did whatever it is that hurt you, like let's say it's someone who is unfaithful, they have to actually be able to trust that their partner won't keep viewing them as a villain for the rest of their lives. That's an element
That's
of
a
trust too.
very, very, very powerful point.
Well, yeah, because who wants
Yeah.
to be in a relationship like that? They don't
When
want to
you're
be in a
constantly
relationship.
being attacked.
Yeah. Even if it's, even if you understand it, it's like, early on, when I'm working with couples, I mean, there is almost never is there any doubt about whether it was wrong or not. Do you know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah.
occasionally there is. Occasionally it's interesting because somebody will say, well, I don't think that's cheating. And the other person will say, yes, it was, like porn, looking at porn, is that cheating or not? Different people have different opinions. But when it's really clear, it's like, no, you were having sex with someone and our deal is monogamy. That's clearly a violation. Neither party is saying, no, it isn't. Very often the one who did the cheating is saying, I can't imagine how that happened, but it did. And they have to be able to see it as they weren't being crazy. If they were being crazy, they have other problems. Most of the time, the folks I work with aren't crazy. They're not psychotic. They're not having manic episodes, usually. Usually they're normal, sane people. They're not evil either. They became susceptible to that and they violated their own values. Well, you know what? Good people occasionally screw up big time. And so to be able to restore trust there, they have to be able to understand themselves and see it as meaningful, even if wrong. And then they have to be able to trust that their partner can do that too, because otherwise it's going to be a situation where they're just feeling, continually they're on probation and their partner is a
Yeah.
probation officer, and most people don't want to live like
Okay, I can certainly think of people who would wanna who would benefit from this episode, Dr. Bruce.
that. I hope so. Yeah. I think so too. Yeah.
Okay. I think we mentioned about fate as well,
Mhm.
and you talk about fate is crucial to a couple. Can you explain that again? What do you mean by fate, and why is it important in relationships?
Yeah, yeah. Well, of course, I'm using this definition of faith that's a pretty general definition, because it's funny. I looked for a better word, but I just couldn't find one. Because when I say faith, people think, "Oh, you mean religion, right?" Well, I don't mean religion. I don't exclude religion, but I'm not specifically referring to religion. I have met very religious people who don't seem to be manifesting the kind of faith I'm talking about, and I met people who do who aren't very religious. And then, of
Mm,
course, I've met lots of religious people who do, either way, it can go either way. But what I mean by faith is that general mindset. I like that concept of mindset. You may have heard of that. They'll talk about growth mindset versus fixed mindset, that sort of
yes.
thing. And I
Yes.
think faith fits in the growth mindset category, actually. What I mean by faith, it's a mindset that says, we can't understand all of reality. There's no way we can understand. We don't have all the data. We don't, whatever your view is, you don't have to be religious to say it this way. We don't have a God's eye view of the universe. We don't have all the
Mm,
data all at once. We just can't.
yes.
We're in the middle of it.
Yes.
So there's all kinds of stuff going on we can't necessarily predict or comprehend. But the mindset underneath that I call faith just says, yeah, but there's some rightness about it. There's some rightness about this is how this is all arranged. It doesn't mean everything's just fine. I'm not saying sometimes people will sort of say, well, everything happens for a reason. I mean, that doesn't really tell me much. Yeah, everything happens for a reason, but that doesn't mean I like it. But I
Yes.
just mean something as awful as, tsunami happens and thousands of people die, right? And
Mm-mm.
there's no way on earth that those people deserved to die. I mean, there's no justice in that.
Yeah.
So how do you make sense of that? This is the classic theological problem. They call it theodicy. It's the problem of how could a good God let bad things happen to good people? That
Right.
sort of thing. But, one way of understanding that horrible thing of tsunamis is, well, there's plate tectonics. And if the earth weren't the way it was, we wouldn't have evolved on it. We're only here because of all that. It's all part of the big picture. Unfortunately, death is part of the big picture too. And sometimes people die way younger than we wish they would. And it's not anybody's fault, but it's kind of part of the big picture. We couldn't tinker with that. We do the best we can to keep people safe. We're never going to fail. We're never going to succeed perfectly. We'll fail sometimes. We should keep trying to do that. But there's some rightness about the whole business. We can't seem to have a world that doesn't have tsunamis in it, because if we did, we wouldn't, everything else wouldn't work. It's
Yeah.
like saying we can't have a world that wouldn't have death in it, because then we
Yes.
wouldn't have life. Nothing would be meaningful. So that's what I
The
mean by a mindset of
duality of
faith.
it.
Yeah. And the opposite of that is a mindset that just says, it sucks. Life's a bitch and then you die, that sort of expression. And I, the folks that I work with, that's where this kind of idea came from in my work. The people who come in, again, I go back to that example of a couple comes in and there's been infidelity, which is close to half of the couples I work with, actually. That's kind of a seat of the pants guess, but I didn't count. But it's real frequent. Let's put it that way. In the first session that they're telling me, yeah, somebody cheated. So the couples that come in and what they're saying is the person who cheated is just saying, I don't know what happened. I'm just crazy. And there's no way I'll do it again. And we just want to go back to how it was. And the other person is, of course, really angry, but they're saying, yeah, this is terrible. And we just have to go back to how it was. Doesn't work. They are not manifesting faith. They're insisting that reality not be what it was. The people who manifest faith come in and they're saying, the person who was cheated on is angry. The person who did the cheating is feeling terrible and guilty, and all of that stuff is still there. But what they're saying is, damn, I wish this hadn't happened, but it did. And we know neither of us is crazy. We're not evil. We're not stupid. There must be some meaning here, even if we don't like it. We better look at it. It takes courage to do that. It takes tolerating enormous amounts of anxiety, but that's a manifestation of faith. It's saying, I know you're, the person saying to the one who cheated, I know you're not evil and I know you're not crazy. So I hate to say it, but there must have been some good reason for this, even if I wish you had done it. And the person themselves who did the cheating has to face that. It's like, because they often want to just say, I must have been nuts. Forget it, and
Mm.
no, you probably weren't. If you were nuts, you got other problems. You probably weren't nuts. You better look at it carefully. And that often invites what it opens up, oddly enough, is intimacy. It's like, we actually better look at all these mixed feelings we have that we've been avoiding. And they've been avoiding it because they don't want things to be so unstable. So that's what faith can do for you. It's not fun to wade into really uncomfortable stuff, but that's often the stuff you need to get to, and that requires faith. You have to be able to say, wow, there's something meaningful in this. We'll come through this together or separate, but we'll come through this with more, with a richer understanding of life than we started. And that's what I mean by faith.
Wow. Wow. Okay. I have nothing to add to that, Dr. Bruce, because, yeah. And I think it's all the more important today because we have so many choices, at least those that are not in committed relationship just yet. And if one thing doesn't work with this person, I can just, cut it off and just move on to the next. But often that leaves a very hollow feeling when you move on to the next, and then of course it's not going to work because there's no stability. It's just the intimacy, the heat of the moment, and then again vicious cycle until you actually wake up and realize, hey, this is stemming from me.
Absolutely.
Now, yeah, because before you become one unit, you are sorry, before you come together, you're one. You are you, and when you come into union with another person, that means you're amalgamating everything, and that provides its own challenges. Being stable within yourself first,
Mhm.
and then knowing where's the line, and then what's it like operating your day to day with your partner.
Mm. Yeah, you've raised some interesting. I'll tell you what thoughts occur to me in terms of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things to point out, and I this is by no means original. In fact, there was a guy, I think his name is Alain de Botton, who wrote a book called "Why You Will Marry the Wrong Person." And
Oh
and he
yeah. I
did you
think
read about? Yeah, I read it. I didn't read the book, but there was an article in the New York
there was
Times
a
about it a few
yes,
years ago.
there
Yeah,
was a summary about it.
yeah, and it was a lot of fun because he's not cynical. He's not saying, "Oh, nobody should ever get married." He's just recognizing, you know what? There's going to be annoyances. You're just picking a set of annoyances when you pick someone. They're going to be there because, like you said, you're you and they're them, and there's going to be these ways that two different people. And it's so interesting because this is true even in gay relationships, but especially in heterosexual relationships. You're picking somebody who you intend to be very different from you in very important ways. If men are looking for
Yeah,
women and women are looking for men, they are clearly looking for something quite different from themselves. And
that's right.
what goes along with the stuff that turns us on is this other stuff that becomes annoying. It's kind of a classic. So you're bound to be annoyed. We actually did a podcast about a year and a half ago. We did it. My wife and I did a podcast. You know what the circumstance was? You'll relate to this, perhaps. I don't know if this has happened to you, but
Okay.
we were all set to interview a guest,
Mm-hmm.
and she had an emergency come up, and so we're sitting there waiting, and then she had to say at the last minute, "Oh, it can't come." So we're sitting there wanting to make our weekly podcast. So I said, "Oh, I know what. Let's make a podcast about the one skill that solves all relationship problems." And my wife looked at me and said, "Oh yeah, right," because she happens to be the sensible one of the two of us. And so I have my head in the clouds. She's like, that's why we make a nice podcast
You
together.
jive.
She's the
Yeah.
real person. Yeah, she's very nice about that. So what is this one skill that solves all relationship problems? Well, it is simply the ability to be mildly annoyed, which is to say, the ability to find your partner somewhat annoying and just think that's sort of
And
cute or
just
charming and not worry about it. And that
right.
happens when you have a large store of goodwill and enormous amounts of appreciation and gratitude.
That's
And
right.
then you're still going to have the annoyances. Although I say in my relationship, I'm the annoying one. I know that. My wife is very nice about that. I'm the annoying one. She's not annoying, but I am. And, she says, no, that's not true. She's annoying too. But, you can tell I'm speaking about it lightly because it's light. because there's so much gratitude there. There's so much appreciation that
Mm,
those inevitable annoyances then just become sort of funny. They don't
yeah.
hurt that much. They're still annoying, but they don't bother, they don't feel like, oh, why am I with this person? And
Yeah.
conversely, when that isn't there, that's both a symptom and a cause. It's talk about vicious cycles. Then it becomes, why am I with this person? They keep bothering me, and all I'm experiencing is annoying, and that becomes the narrative. It's like, we're not right for each other. So I was thinking about that when you're describing, yeah, how do you manage to deal with those differences, and get through that. And you also pointed out one of my favorite things that I did a video a long time ago, and I actually wrote about this in that first book, in Reigniting the Spark. How do you know when to call it quits? I have a chapter on that in that book. How do you know when to call it quits? And my first little pointer about that is, well, first of all, don't break up too soon. Now, what does too soon mean?
Mm,
Who am I to say, right? Well, too soon means whatever too soon means. It means, if you're not dealing with an obvious deal breaker, and there are some things that are just deal breakers. Classic example, two nice people who love each other and treat each other well, but one absolutely wants to have kids and the other absolutely doesn't. Unless somebody changes their mind, that's a deal breaker. It's you can't sort of have kids. You got to have them or not have them, but you can't. There's no in between ground there. But if it's not deal breakers, and you're not unsafe, it's not like you're unsafe. That's a deal breaker too. But if it's just that it's painful, and I'm not trivializing that. That can be really hard. But if you break up too soon, you won't learn what you need to learn. Eventually, you may need to break up, but you better learn what you need. It's exactly what you were talking about earlier, right? You
yes.
better learn what you need to learn, because you know who goes into the next relationship? You do. You take yourself with you. And
Mm,
if you haven't learned what you need to learn, you're very likely going to replicate the same problems or similar problems with someone else. So you if you need to learn, even if you're ultimately going to break up, you need to really get a sense of what's going on there. Because first of all, you might find you don't need to break up. You might find, oh, you have these moments where you recognize, oh, that's where you're coming from, that's where I'm coming from. Well, that wait a minute, maybe we can bridge this gap. Maybe we can actually find each other in here. That can be really exciting. Or you could decide, oh, bummer, you're right to be who you are and I'm right to be who I am, but we're just not right for each other. Well, that's painful. But then you've learned what you need to learn, and you're not breaking up in a panic, because breaking up in a panic tends not to work well. It sets you up for the same problems down the line.
mm. The last part was very impactful as well. I wish I knew you before.
You've been through that, have you?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
well,
yes.
most of us
Oh, well,
have in one time or another.
yeah, so I'm learning now. I'm learning now. And also, Dr. Bruce, the part where you said mildly annoyed, it's like you and your best friends. You and your
Mm.
best friend, right? Right.
Yep.
You somehow know in the back of your head, it's like, okay, it's ride or die with this person, but he or she has done so much for me, and I'm forever indebted, forever grateful. Therefore, this night is actually an identity of what makes me, me love them even more or
Hmm.
cherish them.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, because you're loving them as an actual person.
exactly.
Because,
And nobody's perfect, and you
well,
have your
that
flaws.
no
Yeah.
actual people. That's right. I will
Yes.
occasionally say that to people. It's like, let me check my notes. I think you're both human beings. Is that right? Of course, nowadays, you never know, right? Maybe I'm an AI bot, and a deep fake or something, but I don't think I
I
am,
don't
but
think so. Yeah. I
I
don't
hope
think
not.
so. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think you are either, but you never, it's getting the AI is advancing at a scary rate.
I love that. Well, thank you for that, Dr. Bruce. Okay, we're gonna move into this question about a chapter that you called sex, good sex, and sacred sex.
Hmm.
What are the differences?
Yeah, that's in that book, Reigniting the Spark, that chapter, and I have a video on the subject as well. What I mean by as I say, sex, good sex, and sacred sex, the first part is plain old sex, and then good sex, and then sacred sex. What do I mean by plain old sex? Well, my definition of that is very simple. Whatever you think it is. If you think it's sex, it's sex. I'm not fussy about how you define it. It doesn't have to involve intercourse. It could be whatever you think sex. It doesn't even have to involve the genitals. It's whatever you think
Right.
sex is. Fine, just to have, and I think of them as sort of, like a cumulative course. like
Mm.
math. You have to learn some stuff before you learn the next stuff, because if you don't know that, you won't understand the next stuff. Plain old sex just essentially requires, first of all, that you not be traumatized. And a lot of folks who've been through sexual trauma, it's very difficult for them to have any kind of sex, even with a loving partner, because they're traumatized from some previous experiences. And so they go into a panic or shut
Mm.
down. So plain old sex is about not being traumatized. It's also about having some basic level of knowledge, knowing what's where and what does what. That's basically anatomy and physiology, right? It's like
Mm.
knowing what your anatomy is. And that's especially true for women, I am told. I don't want to mansplain to the woman in the conversation. Women are more often aren't as familiar with their anatomy because men, it's somewhat simpler, at least sexually. Men know where things are more or less. For women, it's more complicated. And of course, that's useful for men to know about women, because men often are woefully ignorant about what's helpful for women and what's helpful for the particular woman they're involved with. All of that fits under the general heading of plain old sex. It's like, yeah, you can't do that if you're going to freak out, or if it's just, if you don't know what you're doing, more or less. Now, what do I call good sex? Well, good sex, if you talk about plain old sex, is a way of physically connecting it's a physical connection. Good sex is a connection that is both physical and also intimate. Now, what do I mean by intimate? Well, it's that sense of intimacy I was mentioning earlier, I think I was mentioning, where you're actually present and honest with yourself and each other. So you let yourself know what you know and feel what you feel, and you're able to share that with your partner. There's an element of vulnerability there. There's an element, Brene Brown talks about that a lot. There's an element of just courage that, again, tolerating the anxiety, that you're willing to let yourself know how you feel and hear how your partner is feeling. That's another one where men as a group, not to stereotype too much, but men as a group aren't often very good at listening to the women in their lives and learning to actually listen and actually do what she likes rather than what you think she likes. I'm saying that to guys, that is a skill that plays out when people can develop that skill. They're much more likely to have intimate sex. And by intimate, it's interesting. I'm not restricting it to slow and loving and romantic. Intimate sex can be whatever people want. It can be rough, it can be kinky, it can be whatever it is. It's really about being present and honest and open. That's what intimate sex is about. So I call that good sex. How do you get from good sex to sacred sex? Well, sacred, it's really sacred sex is more about sacred than it is about sex. What do I mean by sacred sex? Well, the word sacred, it's used in different ways by different people. The word in Latin, and actually it's the Hebrew word kadosh, also has a similar meaning. It means set apart. It is something that is set apart from the ordinary. So sacred sex, like sacred anything else, means you're not just, it's not just the two of you anymore. It's the two of you and all the forces of the universe. And tantra is all about that. The folks who are into tantra, it's all about that sense of connecting with forces way bigger than just the two of you. In
Mm.
some sense, oddly enough, marriage, not always this way, but marriage, as opposed to merely living together and loving each other, and those are not small things, those are important things. But marriage is often an expression that is a similar expression. It says, oh, this union is not just us anymore, it's sacred. And you don't even have to be religious to appreciate. It's like, it's not just us. We are being married in the eyes of our community and our government and everything else. It's like,
Yes.
it's not just about us anymore, is it? Well,
Yes.
sex can be like that too. I'm not talking about threesomes. I
Yeah.
just mean, that's not what I mean. Sex, although I suppose it could happen in threesomes too. I don't know. But I'm talking about sex as that when you're doing whatever you're doing sexually, it's not just about the two of you anymore. It's about being in touch with much bigger forces. So that's a level of sex where you lose yourself in it. And so that's what I mean by sacred sex.
Wow. And I think you pointed it out very rightly on the fact that it's actually ta- tantric, right? Tantric sex. So, and it's more, it transcends the physical, it transcends everything, and you become one, but one and also everything. I mean, the whole reason, I don't know how to explain it, but I get what you mean.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's
Yeah, it's like
sacred. It's
you're participating in the
sacred.
creation of the universe at that moment. There's something
Yeah,
about that. Now,
exactly.
again, nobody, I don't think, nobody has sacred sex all the time. You know
Yes,
what I mean? It's
for
like peak
sure.
experience, kind of by definition, it tends to be a peak, which is to say it happens when it happens. What you can do intentionally is set up conditions that make that possible. That's what folks who meditate, for example, or pray or any of those kinds of practices. It's not
Yeah.
like every time you do it, you have this transcendent experience. But if
Yeah.
you lay the groundwork and practice, you can set up the conditions where if it's going to happen, it can happen, or it's more likely to happen. And
Mm-hmm.
that's really quite lovely. And couples that are into these ideas, you really have to have it's got to be somewhat playful. You have to have the sense of there are the days when it's just sort of run of the mill. It's like, well, whatever, that was nice. And then there are the days where, wow, that was great. And then there are the days where, wow, we don't have words for that.
Yes.
And that's just that you better be okay with that. But that's
Mm-hmm.
because otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
if people are insisting on it, then pressure
Yeah,
does not work. It doesn't work.
exactly. Wow. Awesome, Dr. Bruce. Okay. What are you working on currently?
Uh, Currently, it's funny. I don't have my next book is not yet. It hasn't hatched yet, or it hasn't.
Or
It's in the gestation period. What can I say? I don't know
gestation.
exactly what
Okay.
it'll be. I've switched over my newsletter to Substack now. So I've been
Okay.
working on that sort of thing. If anybody wants to sign up for my newsletter, by the way, and actually maybe I'll use this opportunity to say how can people get in touch with me?
Yes.
They can go to brucechalmer.com. That's where pretty much anything that I do, you can find information about. My practice, of course, my couples coaching or therapy, depending on where you're located, practice is through that. And also, you can find my books anywhere books are sold. And, we like to steer people to Amazon because that's how people find out about books these days. Unfortunately, for good or ill, that's where you go. You can find my books there. And you can find my podcast that I do with my wife, Judy Alexander. You can find my podcast also a link to it at brucechalmer.com, or you can go right to the podcast website, CT in 7. That's like couples therapy in 7 words, CT in the number 7, ctin7.com. That'll get you there. And so if you want to sign up for my newsletter, either of those websites, brucechalmer.com, you'll see a little box will appear. And if you click on it, it'll let you sign up for my Substack. And that's how you.
Brilliant. Okay. I'll be sure to include those in the show notes, Dr. Bruce. Okay, so a few more questions before I let you go, Dr. Bruce. We're going to pivot to a self-worth question because my podcast talks about this. The question for you: imposter syndrome can be a significant barrier to personal and professional growth. Can you share an experience where you face imposter syndrome and how you overcame it?
Yeah, yeah. This maybe is an overstatement. I don't know if I've ever met anybody who doesn't suffer from imposter syndrome. Do you? I mean, it's there. We all on
I can
some
attest to
level.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, on some level, if you don't feel a little bit like that, then maybe you need to be less arrogant. I mean, I can relate to that. It's like, yeah, like how could anybody think I'm an expert on anything? That's that sense of imposter syndrome. What is it that helps people get past that? I'll use two words for that. One is maturity. As you become more mature, I think we tend to worry, and I'm in my 70s now, and I've noted that as I've got older, that sense of having to worry about other people thinking I'm valid or not, I think has lessened as I've gotten older.
Mm,
There's something nice about that. I'm not quite so worried about that as I might have been at one time. And the other is the word I used before, which is faith. That basic sense, what I think faith means when I say that reality is right to be what it is, that includes each of us. In other words, well, apparently I'm right to exist, and so are you, and so is everybody else. And if you start with that, that's kind of the antidote to imposter syndrome. Of course, I'm an imposter if I go around claiming I know everything. Well, I know I don't know everything. I should be an imposter with that. That is being an imposter. It's like, no, I don't know everything. That second book I wrote, the subtitle, the snarky subtitle, the second book, the title was it's not about communication. Why everything you know about
was
couples therapy is wrong.
wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
what a snarky thing to say, right? Well, hey, I mentioned in the book, spoiler alert, I mentioned in that book that applies to me too. Everything I know about couples therapy is wrong too. Now, I'm not saying I don't have good ideas, but I'm saying if I'm claiming that everything I'm saying in there is I know it's right and people who say differently are wrong, then I am an imposter. I should have imposter syndrome if I'm claiming that. And so the antidote to that is to recognize, no, I know perfectly well I don't have the last word on anything. Nobody does. And that means we're really none of us imposters. We're just doing the best we can.
Yes.
One of my sons, Seth Chalmer, he's a writer and he does. I'm putting in a plug for my son. Years ago, I think he was like still in college or maybe just shortly out of college. So many years ago, he's in his 40s now, but he wrote a piece in defense of hypocrisy that I just thought was wonderful. How can you defend hypocrisy? Well, but it has to do with imposter syndrome. I think. I don't think he made that connection, but I'm making it now because that sense that would say, here I am aspiring. I'm claiming we should be honest, we should be upright, we should be, and honorable and all these things that are good values to have. And I'm also recognizing, and if I look at my life, I have failed in those things at various times because everybody has. We've missed the mark sometimes. That's the human condition. Does that mean I'm a hypocrite for espousing those values? No. It just means I'm recognizing, well, I think these are good values, even if I don't always live up to them myself. Imposter syndrome is about this sense that if you're not already perfect in all these various ways, that you're not valid. And the antidote to that is faith. It's like, no, actually, you're valid to be who you are, even when you're screwing up. And so start with that. That's a given. That's the antidote to imposter syndrome. So that's one way of looking.
And going back to the basic, like remembering you're a human, so you don't know everything and it's okay. And we're doing the best, you're doing the best that you can with the knowledge that you have at that moment in time. And especially, yeah, when somebody is like, imposter often, it creeps up when you are claiming or you're being claimed or people are looking to you as the leader or the people that you need to people need they show respect towards, and then somehow you feel like you're not worthy of that respect because why? If only they knew that I crammed this and then I got through the PhD, for example. But then you return to your village. I'm just making an analogy. You return to your hometown and say, oh my God, that is my son, my daughter, and they made it big time there, wherever it is. And yeah, and it can be very demotivating, or it can be very heavy on you. It's a pressure. Like, what if people find out? And I think again, it's all in the mind. And to say, hey, wait a minute, these are actually projections that that is unresolved within me, and what can I do at this point in time, and how do I move from here onward? And it's like a muscle that you train every day. It's how you take shower every day. That's why. And I think just being aware of where you're at, especially if because everybody's aspiring, I hope so, towards becoming the highest version of themselves. And yeah, imposter syndrome can creep up when
Absolutely.
you're on that journey.
Mhm.
So, well, thank you for that insight, Dr. Bruce.
Thank you for yours as well.
What is your heart's greatest wish?
Wow. Boy, I could go on for a while on that. That everybody should experience this sense of life as deeply meaningful, me and everyone else. I guess that would be one way of greatly summarizing it. That's not too much of an ask, is it?
No.
Everybody get along, world peace. Everybody feel good and fulfilled and meaningful. That would be my greatest wish. Well, here I'll quote from this is actually from the Mishnah, which is for people who are Jewish, they'll know what I'm talking about. It's part of the received tradition that goes back a long ways. And one of the rabbis said, it's not ours to complete the task. Neither are we free to desist from participating. So it's that recognition. We're all here to try and do better. We're all here to try and make things better. No one of us is going to completely succeed, but that we're not free to give up. That's the sense that I'd like to say, when you say my heart's greatest wish is that we can all have that sense of meaning, that we can feel like we're participating meaningfully, even if we're not solving all the problems ourselves.
Yeah. And that's you trying your best, and that indirectly and directly making you fulfilled because given your capacity, you've given your best shot
Mhm.
at that.
Yeah.
Whew, wow. Okay, Dr. Bruce, if you could create a quote right now for you to leave to the audience listening and the world as your legacy, what would it be?
Well, that's easy because I've already done that, right? The 7 words. Be kind,
Oh, yeah.
don't panic, and have faith. That's kind of my brand, you know. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith.
Beautiful. Okay. Now, any last message before we wrap the episode, Dr.
Well, I
Bruce?
think I really appreciate this talk. I think that kind of summarizes it, you know. And thank you for the work you're doing in doing this. It's, you know, we don't know. I do a podcast, as you know, as well, and we don't know how we're helping people, but I know we are. You know, I'll hear it occasionally. People will say they were inspired by something they heard, you know, either that my wife and I talked about, or that with a guest that we have on, and people will often say, "Wow, that was really an important thing in my life to hear that." And you know, and I'm sure that's true of your listeners as well. It's nice to know. We don't always get to know, but it's nice that it happens.
Well, thank you for saying that, Dr. Bruce. That means a lot to me. And I believe that I should keep doing this work.
Well, good.
Okay, well, thank you. And that is a wrap on today's inspiring episode with Dr. Bruce Chalmer. Thank you for your wisdom, Dr. Bruce, and for your work and dedication to uplifting others. And to all of our listeners, this has been Your Worthless. Read that again, the juxtaposition of your very soul. Now, if you've ever felt worthless, remember you are not alone. Your soul chose to be here to matter, and you are not, and you are worthy. For that reason alone, you are worthy. A huge thank you to you again, Dr. Bruce, for your time, and to all of you for listening. Until next time, I am Nick Nierras. Keep shining, keep growing, and always remember, you are worthy and you are enough. See you in the next episode. Thank you, Dr. Bruce. Good morning to you, Dr. Bruce. How are you doing today?
I am well. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you for saying yes to be interviewed today. I'd like to introduce myself to you formally and to all of our listeners tuning in. My name is Nicolette. I am the creator for the podcast titled Your Wordless. Read that again, the juxtaposition of your very soul. Now, today we're going to talk about healing from betrayal and learning to trust again amongst all the other spectrum of being in a relationship. I'd like to introduce yourself first to all of our listeners, and then we can get right into the conversation.
Sure.
All right. Hello, everyone. We have Dr. Bruce Chalmer here with us. Dr. Bruce is a psychologist in Vermont who has been working with couples for over 3 decades. Through his teaching, consulting, and books, his ideas have helped thousands of couples and their therapists. Together with his wife, Judy, Dr. Chalmer hosts the podcast Couples Therapy in 7 Words. Now, Dr. Chalmer is also the author of 3 books, Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again. It's not about communication, why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong, and reigniting the spark, why stable couples lose intimacy and how to get it back. Okay, welcome to the show, Dr. Bruce. Love this episode? Now, transformation doesn't end here. Head on to @holistic.lifestyle_with_Nick. That is on my Instagram. Or head on to my website, www.denierras.holisticlifestyle.com for more info on my coaching framework, which is the Worthy, Authentic, and Abundant Framework, digital guides, and my upcoming events such as retreats and master classes and workshops. Now, I also do intuitive readings where we get to check on your